functions of skin. All right, now what I want to do is talk about basically the layers of skin and the organization of skin. All right, so basically we can, some books will say there are 3 layers of skin. Some books will say there are 2. I think your book states that there are 2 layers of skin. All right, so basically the main 2 layers of skin are the epidermis and the dermis. Okay, the epidermis and the dermis. Okay, now remember, from a medical terminology perspective, dermato, that's the word root for skin. Okay, so when you see dermis, okay, that should be a green light saying we're referring to skin here. All right, and then remember the prefix epi. Epi means above. All right, and then dermis. This is basically stating that that's the middle layer of the skin. All right. Now, typically, like I said, some books recognize that there are 3 layers of skin. Some do there are only 2. All right. The other layer that's associated with skin that I'm going to mention briefly is called the hypodermis. Okay, and remember, dermis, hypo meaning below or lower than. Okay, so let's talk about these in order from top to bottom. All right, the epidermis is the outermost layer of skin. All right, the outermost layer of skin. Now remember that the epidermis is, if you look around, if you look at people and you see them, you see skin color, skin tones, you see their skin. That's what you're looking at is the epidermis. Okay. And the epidermis is what is in direct contact with the outside world, that physical barrier that I was talking about. All right, and histologically, the epidermis is made out of stratified, squamous, as some people pronounce it, stratified squamous, epithelial tissue. And we would also say that this tissue is keratinized. All right, we'll talk about that in a second. All right, but let's review some basic histology terminology. Remember, when you're talking about histology, when you're talking about epithelial tissue, remember stratified means 2 or more layers. So what we're saying here are, so if we said this was simple epithelium, there would just be 1 layer of cells. All right, but this is stratified, so there's multiple layers of cells piled on top of each other. Right, and you see this when you look under the microscope. And you take a look at the epidermis of skin, you see many, 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 many layers of the epidermis. Okay, so that's why we call it stratified. All right, and then remember squamous. Squamous cells, remember, are basically, simply put, they're just small, flat cells. All right, they're just very, very small, flat, extremely boring-looking cells. Now, remember epithelial tissue. A good way to remember epithelial tissue is that epithelial tissue lines the body. Specifically, it lines body cavities, hollow organs. All right. So epithelial tissue, is the outer lining of the body. All right. The stratified squamous epithelial keratinized tissue lines the entire outside of our body. Okay. When we talk about blood vessels and you learn about endothelial cells lining the inside, all right, that's a lining. When we talk about the digestive system, all right, and we talk about the mucosa of the digestive system, the innermost layer of that is made out of epithelial cells, all right? So basically anywhere where you find epithelial tissue, it's a lining, it's a covering of some sort, okay? Now we say keratinized because of the presence of a protein called keratin, all right? And now basically what happens in a nutshell, I'll get more in depth with this in a little bit when I get more in depth with the epidermis, but basically as cells work their way up through the layers of the epidermis, they die, all right? And as they die, you find this very hard, tough protein in there called keratin. Okay, so they're keratinized cells. All right. Now there are 2 types of stratified, squamous epithelial cells, and there's keratinized and non-keratinized. Okay, so this keratinized you only find in the epidermis of the skin. Okay, non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue you find basically lining kind of wet areas of the body, all right, like the inner lining of the vagina or the esophagus, okay, areas where there's lots of watery type secretions, all right. So that's the epidermis, the outermost layer of the skin, that what you guys tend to think about as that actual physical barrier, Okay, but remember, there are also neurons in here. This is where you find, a lot of the macrophages in the skin, the phagocytes. We'll talk about more cells in the epidermis a little bit. All right. Now the dermis, the middle layer of the dermis, basically consists of, a lot of it is areolar CT. All right, areolar, meaning if you look at all of the proteins in the matrix of the tissue and where all the cells are, there's a lot of space between them. Okay, a lot of space between the proteins in the matrix of the tissue and also between the cells of the tissue. All right, so basically what you're saying here, you're saying that, well, maybe there's room for airflow or flow through these. All right. So that's the dermis. And this is typically the thickest portion of skin. All right, and the dermis itself is where you find lots of blood vessels. This is where you find a lot of other nerves. This is where you find sweat glands. This is where hair growth begins. All right, there's a lot of stuff going on here in the dermis, and we'll talk more in depth about the dermis in a little bit. All right, but that's basically what the dermis is. Just that there's a lot of space in here where there's a lot of other stuff going on. Like I said, lots of circulation to the skin, circulation of sweat glands. The roots and bulbs of the hair, things like that. Okay, and the hypodermis, this is relatively simple. This is just adipose tissue. Okay, remember, adipose tissue is basically fat. All right, so you have a layer of fat. This is what's oftenly referred to as subcutaneous fat. Okay, subcutaneous fat, and this is real easy to talk about because this is where you guys remember the function of adipose tissue. We use adipose tissue to store calories, all right? There are some cases where there's a type of fat called brown fat, but humans don't have a lot of it. Brown fat is very metabolically active and it's used to generate heat, okay? But, we're born with some brown fat, but most of it typically goes away by the time we're adults, okay? So the fat in humans is primarily used for storage purposes, primarily. There's other fats we'll talk about later on, all right? And, there's a lot of blood vessels found within here as well. You've probably heard the term subcutaneous injection. Okay, so when you place the needle down into the hypodermis, all right, it's a lot easier to hit those bigger blood vessels because the vessels in the dermis are a lot smaller than that of the hypodermis, okay? So that's a subcutaneous injection. Now, what else do I want to say about that? So also, if you guys have ever had a pinch test or a skin fold measurement, this is, when you do that, you do this to test people's body fat composition, and you compare how much body fat, how much fat mass do they have compared to lean mass, muscles and bones and other organs, all right? So when they do that pinch test, they're measuring how thick this layer of skin is, okay? And the thicker it is, the more body fat you have, the higher the body fat percentage, all right? And that's what people need to, and, and as it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, that's when you start to see a lot of health-related issues and problems. And that's why, I always encourage people, when they're trying to exercise or to get in better shape, not to focus on body weight per se, but to focus on body fat percentage, okay? Because, as you exercise, body weight's going to go up a little bit. Your muscles are going to grow. Your bones are going to thicken, all right? You're going to have cellular growth going on in tissues. You're going to gain weight, all right? You're going to gain weight as you exercise, all right? But the whole point of this is to burn fat, all right, to stay healthier. So that's why it's more important to pay closer attention to body fat percentage than body weight overall. Okay, I'm not saying don't look at body weight, but body weight is not as good of an indicator of health than body fat percentage, especially where the fat is located. We'll talk more about that when we get to the endocrine system and metabolism and things like that. Okay, but these are the three, like I said, the three major layers of skin. All right. So now what I want to do next, I'm gonna start another video segment for this, but I want to start talking about these three layers. Well, really, we've already covered the hypodermis, so I want to cover the epidermis and the dermis in more detail.